I will give you acupuncture, and then you will walk again." The new housemaid knelt on the rug in the middle of the drawing room and unrolled a worn leather case holding needles as fine as strands of hair. Emilio Ferraro sat in his wheelchair, looking down at her. The second-generation boss of the Ferraro family, the man who controlled every dock and every transport union in Chicago, had become a man who could not rise from his own seat. The room burst into laughter. His fiancée leaned against the doorway with her arms folded and her lip curled. His underboss of 14 years swirled a glass of whiskey and chuckled. "Looks like we just hired a doctor for the price of a floor scrubber." For 8 months, the 6 finest neurologists in the state of Illinois had told him the same thing. He would never walk again, but Emilio did not send her away. He quietly extended toward her the 2 feet that had felt nothing for 8 months. The maid said not another word. She dried her hands, traced her fingers along his calf, and set down the first needle, the second, the third. At the 4th needle, his big toe twitched. It was very small. No one else in that room saw it. Only she did. And only he did. Emilio went utterly still. And in that moment he did not yet know that the woman kneeling at his feet had just saved his life. Because 3 days later, those same hands would place on his desk a small white pill picked up from the hallway carpet, along with a question no doctor had dared to ask him in 8 months. And that question would expose a plot that had been prepared for 8 months by the person he trusted most in this world. A plot that he himself had been swallowing twice a day. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we'll know you're still listening. Share this video with someone you cherish. Because sometimes the right story at the right moment can bring warmth to their entire day. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can meet again in the next story. The night before, nearly all the lights in the Ferraro mansion had gone dark. Camille Doyle had just finished cleaning the 2nd floor when she heard the sharp, dry sound of something breaking inside the study at the end of the hallway. She stopped for several seconds, waiting for the footsteps of a guard or the housekeeper, but the only sound in the corridor was the ticking of the clock. No one came. She pushed open the door. Emilio Ferraro was sitting in his wheelchair in the middle of the room, both hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles had turned white, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, with a shattered glass lying beneath the table. The muscles in his calf had contracted into a rigid knot, yet he hadn't called for anyone. He only clenched his teeth and endured it, like a man who had grown so accustomed to suffering that crying out no longer occurred to him. Camille didn't ask permission. She set the tray of towels on the floor, knelt beside the wheelchair, and ran both thumbs along his calf until she found exactly 3 points. Then she pressed down, held the pressure steady, and counted silently in her mind. 20 seconds passed. The knotted muscle beneath her hands began to soften. 40 seconds. His breathing lengthened and steadied. When the spasm had completely eased, she released him, stepped back, and lowered her head, waiting to be reprimanded. Emilio looked down at her for a long time. During the past 8 months, no one in that house had dared touch his legs without permission. He asked her name. She answered simply, "Camille Doyle, 2nd floor maid." He asked nothing more. She gathered the broken pieces of glass onto the tray, wiped up the spilled water, then withdrew and closed the door very gently, as though what had just happened had never happened at all. The following morning, everything returned to its usual order. At 6:30, she went into the master bedroom, drew back the curtains, replaced the towels, dusted the picture frames on the writing desk, and finally cleared the small tray beside the water pitcher. On the tray were a drinking glass, a silver spoon, and the pills the family's private physician had left for the morning. She emptied what remained, rinsed the glass, and arranged the tray neatly again. She had performed those same motions every morning for 5 weeks, long enough for her hands to remember them without any thought from her mind. Downstairs in the kitchen, the elderly cook was struggling with a pot of oatmeal, her hands trembling so badly that she couldn't hold the ladle. Camille took it from her, stirred the oatmeal, then poured coffee for both of them. The cook asked whether the little girl had slept well the night before. Camille said she had, though she'd needed another pillow to keep her head elevated. Maeve was 6 years old, born with a damaged heart, and the doctors said that one day she would need surgery. The cook asked how long Camille's husband had been gone. 3 years, Camille answered. The cook remained silent for a while, then asked the question she'd wanted to ask for several weeks. Why was a woman with hands like hers scrubbing floors in someone else's house? Camille gave a faint, bitter smile. She had once been licensed to practice acupuncture and physical therapy, and had worked at a pain relief clinic in the northern suburbs, until the day a patient died there, and someone needed a name to place in the official report. That name was hers. Her license was revoked. Her record was stamped, and afterward, not a single medical facility in Chicago returned her calls. Working as a maid was the only job that would still take her, and it paid enough to keep her daughter on the waiting list for surgery. The cook asked nothing else. She only pushed the plate of bread toward Camille and murmured that life could sometimes be cruel for no good reason. Camille hadn't had time to answer when the internal bell rang in the kitchen. The housekeeper came downstairs, looked slowly around the room, then stopped at her. The boss wanted to see her in the drawing room. The entire kitchen fell silent. The cook released the ladle. Camille set down her coffee cup, wiped her hands on her apron, and for one fleeting moment, she thought she would be dismissed that very morning for daring to touch that man's leg. She went to her room first, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the thing she'd kept there for 3 years without opening it once since the day she lost her profession. It was an old leather roll, worn along the edges, holding needles as fine as strands of hair. She held it in her hands and stood motionless for several seconds, then walked down the stairs. When Camille rolled up the leather case and left the drawing room, the laughter of those who remained followed her all the way into the hallway. She had taken about 10 steps when a figure detached itself from the doorway and blocked her path. Rocco Barone didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood there with both hands in his pockets, his head tilted as he studied her the way someone might look at an object that had been placed in the wrong part of his house. He said he'd stood beside the boss for 14 years, that during those 14 years, he'd watched every kind of person pass through this house, and all of them had shared one thing. They had all believed they were special. Still speaking in that calm voice, he went on to say that a maid's job was to clean the floors, replace the towels, and remain silent, and that anyone who crossed that line usually didn't remain for long. Then he asked whether she had a daughter and how old the girl was. Camille answered that she was 6. He nodded and said that children at that age needed a stable home and a mother with a job, and that he believed Camille was a woman capable of thinking carefully. He tapped the doorframe twice, then walked away, leaving her alone in the hallway with the leather roll still warm in her hands. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the housekeeper came down to the kitchen and summoned her again. This time, she wasn't taken to the drawing room, but to the study. Emilio sat behind the desk with the door closed, and there was nothing on the surface before him except a thick medical file and a pen with its cap still on. He didn't invite her to sit, nor did he ask where she'd studied, where she'd worked, or why she'd come there. He asked only one question, and he asked it very slowly. If she was lying to him, did she know what she would lose? Camille didn't lower her head. She said she hadn't promised that she could make him walk again, and if anyone that morning had understood her to mean otherwise, then they had misunderstood. Acupuncture couldn't reconnect a severed nerve, and anyone who claimed otherwise was selling him something that didn't exist. But there was one thing she could say. The muscles in both his legs had atrophied evenly, so evenly that they were almost symmetrical, and in 4 years of placing her hands on the legs of hundreds of people, she had never encountered a spinal cord injury that developed that way. A genuine injury was uneven. It was always uneven. Emilio remained silent for a long time. Then he pushed the thick file across the desk toward her and asked, in the voice of a man who had asked himself the same question many times over the past 8 months, why the 6 finest neurologists in the state of Illinois had stood exactly where she was standing, read every page in that file, and not one of them had seen what she'd just described. What gave her the right to see it? Camille looked directly at him. She said those 6 doctors had each examined him once, and all 6 had read the same file prepared by the same person. But she had placed her hands on his legs every day for 3 weeks, and a person's hands remembered what the eyes overlooked. Then she spoke one final sentence, so brief that Emilio had to repeat it once inside his mind. She wasn't better than they were. She was only closer. The only sound left in the study was the crackling fire. Emilio watched her for a long time, longer even than he had the previous night, then told her to come there every afternoon at 4 o'clock and not speak of it to anyone. She nodded and withdrew. At dinner that evening, Juliana Mancuso waited until the servants had brought out the main course before she spoke. She turned her wineglass slowly and said she'd heard there was a new miracle healer in the house, and how fortunate it was that these days an entire clinic could be purchased for the wages of someone who scrubbed floors. A few quiet laughs rose and faded. Camille stood close to the wall with the bread tray held against her, her eyes lowered toward the carpet. She didn't blush, tremble, or answer with a single word. Emilio continued cutting the meat on his plate as though he hadn't heard anything. But when Camille passed behind him to clear the plate beside his, he raised his head and said, just loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, that he wanted his coffee a little stronger the following morning. That was all, a sentence with nothing to do with the conversation. But Juliana set down her wineglass and for the rest of the meal, she didn't speak again. At the far end of the table, Rocco stopped chewing and watched the maid disappear through the kitchen door. He said nothing. 3 days later, Dr. Elliot Brennan's morning examination ended nearly 20 minutes earlier than usual. Camille was wiping down the second-floor stair rail when she heard the study door open and footsteps moving rapidly along the hallway. So rapidly that they didn't sound like the steps of a man who had just finished his work, but those of someone who wanted to leave the house as quickly as possible. The doctor passed her, offering a hurried nod, his leather briefcase tucked beneath one arm with its clasp still unfastened. He didn't stop or say a word, and he failed to notice that when he swung the briefcase to his other side, something tiny fell from his coat pocket and landed on the red carpet without making a sound. At the far end of the hallway, Maeve was sitting on the steps leading into the garden, waiting for her mother to finish working so she could go outside and watch the birds. The little girl saw something white roll toward her feet. She leaned forward, picked it up, and opened her hand to study it as though she'd discovered a precious jewel. Then she ran along the hallway to her mother and raised her closed fist triumphantly, like a child who had just found treasure hidden beneath the floor. "Mommy, I found this. It's so very round." Camille laughed, stroked her daughter's hair, and opened her palm to receive it. Then she froze. The smile remained on her lips, but it stopped halfway. Every morning for 5 weeks, her hands had cleared the tray beside the water pitcher in the master bedroom, and those hands remembered exactly what the pills on that tray looked like. This one was different. The groove across its center wasn't in the right place, and the rim around its edge was different as well. It wasn't one of the pills the Ferraro boss took twice each day. Camille raised her eyes toward the end of the hallway. The main door had already closed. Outside, Dr. Brennan's car started. Then its sound receded along the gravel drive. She told Maeve to run outside and play in the garden, promising that her mother would come down shortly. The little girl ran off, her hair lifting in the sunlight, with no idea what she'd just done. Camille remained alone in the hallway, the pill clenched inside her palm, and for one moment, she wished her daughter had never picked it up. Throughout that afternoon, she worked like someone walking through a dream. She wiped the same place on a table twice. She folded the towels, unfolded them, then folded them again. The pill rested in her apron pocket, so light that it seemed to have almost no weight. Yet every time she bent down, she could feel it there. Inside her mind, 2 voices took turns speaking, and neither would yield. One asked who she was to dare open her mouth. She was a maid who had been in that house for 5 weeks, without a license or professional standing. Her name buried in a stamped record at her former clinic. And only 3 days earlier, a man had blocked her path in that very hallway to remind her that her job was to clean the floors and remain silent. If she spoke and she was wrong, she would be dismissed before sunset. Losing this job meant losing their home, losing the only wages keeping Maeve's name on the surgery waiting list, and losing the final fragile thing she still had left to hold. She had already lost everything once. She knew exactly what it felt like to hold an official decision in her hands and understand that beginning the following day, no one would ever return her calls again. But the other voice refused to be silent. It asked what she was preserving if she said nothing. It reminded her of the muscles she'd felt beneath her palms for the past 3 weeks, wasting evenly on both sides like 2 shadows cast from the same body, a symmetry no genuine injury could create. It reminded her of the man sitting alone in his wheelchair inside the study after midnight, gritting his teeth through the pain without calling anyone. Because in that house filled with people, he no longer trusted anyone enough to call, and it asked her a question she couldn't answer. If someone had been willing to speak the truth 3 years earlier, would she now be standing there in that uniform, with her roll of needles hidden in the bottom drawer? By the time darkness settled, Camille stood beside the sink, with both hands still wet, staring at the white pill in the center of her palm. She had made her decision, but she also knew that the moment she placed it on that desk, there would be no way back. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Camille went to the study as she did every day. She unrolled the leather case, arranged the needles in order, knelt beside the wheelchair, and worked in silence as she had before. Emilio closed his eyes and rested his head against the back of the chair, and during the first 20 minutes, neither of them spoke a word. Then Camille set down the final needle, wiped her hands on a towel, and instead of rising to put away her things, she reached into her apron pocket. She placed the white pill on the writing desk, directly in the middle of the empty wooden surface, then stepped back. Emilio opened his eyes. She said that Dr. Brennan had dropped it on the hallway carpet the previous morning, and that she'd been clearing the medicine tray in his bedroom every morning for the past 5 weeks. So there was one thing she knew with certainty. This pill hadn't come from that tray. Emilio didn't look at the pill. He looked at her. Camille continued, her voice slowing as though she were weighing each word before allowing it to fall. She said she'd been carrying this thought in her mind for 3 weeks and hadn't dared speak, but she was going to speak now. Whatever was causing the muscles in his legs to waste away wasn't coming from his spine. It wasn't rising from below. It was spreading from within. Something was slowly draining his body from the inside, and no collision on Lower Wacker Drive could have caused that. Then she asked him one question. During the past 8 months, had he ever taken his medication to be tested somewhere no one in that house knew about? The study fell silent. Emilio Ferraro's expression didn't change. He had trained himself to do that since he was 17 years old. Inside rooms where one facial muscle twitching at the wrong moment could cost a man his life, and he'd become so skilled at it that people called it the unreadable Ferraro face. But his right hand tightened around the wheelchair armrest, squeezing until the leather covering made a dry, strained sound. And he didn't realize he was doing it. Inside his mind, 11 years ran backward very quickly. Elliot Brennan was the man who'd sat through the night beside his father's bed after the first stroke, the only one of 4 doctors that day who said the old man still had a chance, and his father had lived for another 3 years. Elliot Brennan was the man who sat beside his mother's bed on the night she died, holding her hand, and when it was over, he was the one who stepped into the hallway and told Emilio, speaking in the voice of someone suffering a loss, rather than someone delivering news. Elliot Brennan was the man who drove alone to a warehouse in Gary at 3 o'clock in the morning, asked no questions, stitched the wound in Emilio's side by flashlight, then went to work the following morning as though nothing had happened. 11 years. He had never missed an appointment. He had never asked for money. He had never spoken a word to anyone outside the family. Emilio picked up the pill, turned it gently between 2 fingers, and held it toward the light from the window. It was small, white, and ordinary, identical to the thousands of pills he'd swallowed during the past 8 months without examining a single one closely. In a voice so calm that even Camille felt chilled, he told her to go home and said that only the 2 of them knew what had happened that afternoon. If a third person learned of it, he would know who was responsible. Camille rolled up the leather case, lowered her head, and withdrew. The door closed. Emilio remained alone in the study until the sun had completely set, without turning on a light or calling anyone, the pill still held between 2 fingers. He no longer thought about Brennan. He thought about something else, something simpler and colder. If there was something wrong with this pill, then the person who placed it in his hand each morning was only the hand. A hand always had a head behind it. Late that night, he rolled his wheelchair to the portrait of his father hanging on the wall, opened the safe behind it, placed the pill inside a small box, and locked it away. Then he picked up the internal telephone, dialed a single number, and spoke only one sentence. Have the car ready at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Come alone. Tell no one, including Rocco. On the other end, Gus Petrosino didn't ask a single question. 18 years behind the wheel for the Ferraro family had taught him that when instructions for a journey were given that carefully, no questions were ever permitted. Emilio didn't sleep that night. There are some suspicions that, once planted, never sleep again. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the black car rolled through the mansion gates, while the entire house was still asleep. Gus Petrosino didn't turn on the radio or ask where they were going until Emilio gave him the name of the university. And even then, he merely nodded once and turned onto the main road. It was still dark. Lake Michigan lay to their left, black and motionless. Emilio sat in the back with the small box resting on his lap, and throughout the 40-minute drive, he didn't say another word. They went around to the rear entrance of the research building and descended into a basement where the elevator required 2 separate card scans before it would open. The hallway below was cold and brightly lit, the smell of alcohol mingling with the hot metallic scent of machinery that had been running all night. Professor Harriet Vogel waited at the far end of the corridor, 63 years old, her silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, the sleeves of her lab coat rolled to her elbows. She and Emilio's father had been classmates before either of them was married, and throughout the past 30 years, she'd known only one thing about Emilio, that he was the son of her late friend. She had never asked what he did for a living in Chicago, and he had never told her. She saw the wheelchair and hesitated for 1 second, then asked no questions. She only said, "Bring it in here." Emilio handed her the box. She took it, entered the inner laboratory, and the glass door closed behind her. 9 hours passed. Gus bought coffee twice. Emilio didn't drink a single sip. He sat motionless in that white hallway with both hands resting on his lap, staring at one point on the wall without seeing anything, telling himself that there were dozens of ways an unfamiliar pill might fall from a doctor's pocket. It could have belonged to another patient. It could have been a sample from a pharmaceutical company. It could have been anything. He considered every possibility that might excuse a man he'd trusted for 11 years. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the glass door opened. Harriet Vogel stepped out, and Emilio knew immediately. Not because of anything she said, but because during those 9 hours in the basement, she had visibly aged. She placed a stack of papers on the low table in the hallway, pulled over a chair, sat at his eye level, and spoke without evasion. She said the pill contained no active ingredient intended to restore nerve function. None at all. Nothing inside it had ever been formulated to help anyone walk again. She said it contained an agent that gradually caused the muscles to lose their ability to respond. The longer it was taken, the more the muscles stopped receiving commands, and beyond a certain point, the damage could no longer be reversed. She said she'd run the analysis 3 times because she hadn't believed the first result. Emilio asked how long it took to reach that point. She was silent for a moment, then said it depended on the individual, but usually about a year. Then she asked how long he'd been taking it. Emilio said 8 months. Harriet Vogel closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a scientist reading test results, but the voice of a woman forced to tell her old friend's son something she didn't want him to hear. She said that for 8 months, twice each day, he had placed it inside his own body with his own hand. On the low table was a glass of wine she'd poured for him earlier, which he hadn't touched. Emilio reached for it. He didn't intend to drink. He merely needed something to hold. His fingers tightened around it, and continued tightening, and he didn't realize what he was doing until the stem made a very faint sound and shattered inside his palm. Red wine ran over his wrist, down his trouser leg, and dripped onto the white tile floor. Harriet Vogel sprang to her feet and called for someone to bring bandages. Emilio didn't move. He looked down at his hand, saw the shards of glass, saw the red liquid, and felt no pain. He felt nothing at all. There was only one image inside his mind, the small tray beside the water pitcher in his bedroom, morning after morning, evening after evening, for 8 months, and his own hand lifting the pill to his mouth. The 6 finest doctors in the state had told him he would never walk again. Not one of those 6 doctors had lied. They simply didn't know that the thing slowly killing his legs wasn't inside his spine. It was resting on the silver tray beside his bed every morning. On the journey home, Emilio sat in silence with his hand wrapped in bandages, and he had already begun to calculate. Some wounds never bleed where anyone can see them. The car reached the mansion gates before dawn. Emilio changed his shirt, removed the bandages from his hand, and wrapped it again with a thin handkerchief so no one would notice, then positioned himself beside the study window as though he'd been sitting there throughout the night. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Elliot Brennan knocked on the door, punctual as he'd been for 11 years. He measured Emilio's blood pressure, tested his reflexes, wrote several lines in his notebook, then handed him a small medicine cup and a glass of water. Emilio took them, raised the pill to his mouth, tilted his head back, and swallowed. Or at least, that was how it appeared. The pill rested neatly beneath his tongue, small and hard, and he kept it there while setting down the glass, while nodding his thanks, and while asking whether Brennan could stop by later that afternoon to examine the elderly cook's knee. Only after the door had closed and the footsteps had receded did Emilio spit it out, open the bottom drawer on the left, and drop it into a small glass jar with a screw top. Another pill went in that evening, 2 more the following day. Every day, 2 pieces of evidence fell to the bottom of that jar with a faint clicking sound, and Emilio counted each one inside his mind the way a man counted the beat of war drums. At noon that day, he rolled his wheelchair to the far end of the garden, hidden behind a hedge, and took from his pocket a cheap telephone Gus had purchased with cash from a store across the city. 3 calls. None lasted longer than 4 minutes. Before nightfall, 4 men who had once served in the military were positioned around the outer perimeter of the estate, one disguised as a tree trimmer, another as an employee of the electric company, while the remaining 2 were never seen at all. They wore no Ferraro insignia. They didn't enter through the main gates. They reported to only one person, Gus, and Gus reported to only one person, Emilio. No one on the official security team knew those 4 men existed. Not the head of security, not the lawyers, and above all, not Rocco. That night, sitting in the darkness of the study, Emilio asked himself the question he'd avoided for 2 days. If someone wanted him dead, 8 months had been more than enough time to accomplish it. 1 wrong injection, 1 dose 5 times too strong. One night when no one heard anything, Anyone capable of replacing what lay on his medicine tray was also capable of ending everything in a single morning. So why had they allowed him to live? He sat for a long time, and then the answer appeared, precise and cold, like a clause printed on paper, because his father had written it himself. In the bylaws the old man established during the earliest years of building the family enterprise, there was one provision every member of the family knew by heart, and no one was permitted to change. If the head of the family died under suspicious circumstances, all authority wouldn't pass to his second-in-command, but would immediately transfer to a council of 3 senior caporegimes until a final judgment was reached. The old man had written that provision after watching an allied family destroy itself over exactly such a betrayal. He had written it to protect his son from those standing closest to him, and 40 years later, that line of text was the only thing keeping Emilio alive. The person behind this didn't need him dead. That person needed him alive. Alive, confined to this wheelchair, growing weaker with every passing month. Alert enough to hold a pen, and desperate enough to sign whatever anyone placed before him. Everything from the past 8 months suddenly arranged itself into a single line. The way he'd gradually handed his responsibilities to others. The way people spoke more often about the wedding than about business. The way stacks of documents appeared on his desk with the same familiar words. Just sign them and be done with it. I'll take care of the rest. From that day forward, Emilio began studying people instead of papers. And the first person he studied was Elliot Brennan. He didn't watch what Brennan did. He watched how he did it. Those hands, the same hands that had stitched Emilio's wound by flashlight inside a warehouse in Gary at 3 o'clock in the morning without trembling by so much as a hair, now shook faintly whenever they snapped open the top of a medicine vial, so faintly that anyone else would have blamed his age. And whenever footsteps passed in the hallway outside, Brennan's eyes flicked toward the door. Only one quick glance, followed by an immediate lowering of his gaze. Emilio remembered every detail and said nothing. The first thing Emilio did was get Rocco out of the city. He didn't issue an order, because a sudden command would make the person standing closest to him ask why. He merely allowed a small rumor to travel along the proper path, saying that a group in St. Louis wanted to renegotiate its share of the southern shipping route, and that the other side would only agree to a meeting if someone from the Ferraro family came in person. Rocco received the information on Tuesday afternoon, and by evening, he was the one who entered the study and offered to go. Emilio pretended to hesitate for a while, asked 2 questions about the schedule, then nodded. On Wednesday morning, Rocco's car left the gates. He would be gone for 2 days. At 9 o'clock that morning, a man 66 years old entered the Ferraro mansion as an old family friend visiting from Europe. The housekeeper met him at the door, the servants poured coffee, and no one asked another question, because old friends like this had been visiting the house for years. His name was Anselm Roth. He had come from Zurich, and in Europe, people waited months to secure an appointment with him. That morning, he carried no large medical case, only a thin leather bag. Camille led him upstairs. She didn't know who he was. She knew only that the boss had instructed her to take the guest to the master bedroom, and that no one was permitted upstairs afterward until further notice. The door was locked from inside. The curtains were drawn. Only one table lamp was turned on. 2 hours passed in almost absolute silence. Anselm Roth worked slowly and spoke no unnecessary words. He tested the reflexes on each side, compared the circumference of Emilio's calves with a measuring tape, pressed along each muscle group, and recorded its response, then moved a handheld scanning device along Emilio's spine, his eyes fixed on the screen of a tablet resting on the pillow. At one point, he stopped over the same area for a long time, stepped back, then began again from the beginning. Emilio lay motionless, staring at the ceiling without asking a single question. At last, Roth set down the device, pulled a chair beside the bed, removed his glasses, cleaned them, and sat in silence for a while. Then he spoke. He said the nerve damage from the night on Lower Wacker Drive was real. He wouldn't lie about that. And Emilio needed to understand that it was real, but it wasn't something any decent physician would call permanent. He said the signals were still passing through, only weakly and slowly, like an electrical wire being compressed rather than severed. What had transformed his condition into what it was now wasn't inside his spine. It was the fact that for 8 months, his body had continuously received a substance that caused his muscles to stop responding, and the longer muscles remained unused, the more they forgot how to function. Then he said the words Emilio had been waiting to hear but hadn't dared name inside his mind. If he stopped taking the substance immediately, and if he followed the proper therapy with discipline every night without missing a single session, he would walk again in about 3 months. Not perfectly at first. He would fall. The pain would become so severe that he would want to give up, but he would walk. Emilio remained motionless for a long time. In 8 months, this was the first time anyone had sat beside his bed and spoken a sentence that didn't begin with the words, "I am sorry." He asked once more, slowly and almost in a whisper, whether Roth was certain. Anselm Roth nodded. He opened the leather bag, removed a collection of handwritten pages, and placed them in Emilio's hands. They contained the entire therapy program, every movement, every breath, and every warning sign that meant he must stop immediately, written in the careful, slanting script of someone who had devoted his entire life to this work. Then Roth rose, bent down, placed a hand on Emilio's shoulder, and gave it one firm squeeze, so firm that no one would have believed it belonged to a man 66 years old. "Your legs aren't dead. They've only been forced to sleep. Wake them." Then he gathered his equipment, left the room, descended through the service passage behind the kitchen, and departed the estate before the servants brought out lunch. Not one camera in the house captured his face. In the bedroom, Emilio sat against the headboard with the pages resting on his lap and the curtains still drawn. He read the first page, then read it again. Outside, birds were singing in the garden, and someone was calling to another person downstairs in the kitchen. Inside Emilio's chest, something very warm had begun to rise, something he had believed for 8 months that he would never feel again. A therapy program written on paper was worthless without a living person standing beside him every night. Emilio understood that the moment he finished reading the final page, he needed someone to help him rise when he fell, someone who knew how to massage his muscles until they relaxed after each session, and above all, someone who wouldn't tell anyone what they were doing. That night, he sat in the study and considered every name in his household, one by one. Rocco was out of the question. All 3 captains beneath him had been promoted by Rocco himself. The housekeeper reported the household schedule to the office, and Rocco had controlled that office for the past 8 months. The head of security received his salary from an account personally approved by Rocco. Even the 2 longest-serving members of the household staff, people who had been there since his father's time, had children employed within the warehouse system Rocco managed. Emilio crossed each name off inside his mind, and when he reached the last one, he understood something that left him sitting in silence for a very long time. In a house with more than 20 people serving him, the head of the family couldn't find a single person he could ask for help. Then he thought about the woman who had placed the pill on his desk. But Emilio wasn't the kind of man who trusted someone merely because she'd performed one good deed. He had seen too many people do one good thing in exchange for 10 others, so he decided to watch her, and he watched for 7 days. On the 2nd day, he had his wheelchair pushed through the hallway behind the kitchen at precisely the hour when the servants ate lunch. The door stood slightly open. At the long table, portions of stew were being divided among the plates, each serving the same as the next. The elderly cook sat at the far end, her hands trembling so badly that her spoon clinked against the edge of her plate. Camille said nothing. She simply lifted the largest piece of meat from her own plate, placed it on the older woman's plate, and cut it into small pieces she could manage. She did it so naturally that no one at the table even looked up. On the 4th day, a brown tea stain appeared on the tablecloth in the small dining room. The housekeeper summoned Camille and scolded her in front of 3 other people, calling her careless and saying that she'd only just arrived yet was already becoming negligent. Emilio sat in the adjoining room with the door slightly open, and he'd seen clearly what had happened half an hour earlier, when Juliana set her teacup near the edge of the cloth and walked away. Camille didn't argue. She said, "I'm sorry. I'll wash it again immediately," and carried the tablecloth away. On her way out, she passed Juliana standing at the foot of the stairs, and still lowered her head in greeting as she always did. On the 6th day, Emilio had a stack of papers placed openly inside the writing desk drawer in the master bedroom. The drawer was unlocked and left open by about the width of one finger joint. The following morning, he lay with his eyes closed and pretended to be asleep while Camille cleaned the room. She drew back the curtains, replaced the towels, then dusted the framed photograph of his father on the desk, cleaning it carefully, including the back and the base of the frame. When she finished, she pushed the open drawer completely closed and walked out. She didn't open it. She didn't even glance inside. At midnight on the 7th day, the internal bell rang in the servants' quarters. Camille reached the study within 4 minutes, her hair still wet from washing her face, both hands clasped in front of her. Emilio told her to close the door. Then he spoke directly, without any preamble. He said someone inside the house had been giving him the substance that had reduced his legs to this condition for 8 months, and he didn't yet know who it was. He said his legs weren't permanently destroyed, that someone had examined him and confirmed that if he followed the proper therapy for 3 months, he would walk again. He said those sessions had to take place in the basement every night, and no one in the house could be allowed to know. Then he looked directly at Camille and told her the final thing. He needed someone who reported to no one. And among the more than 20 people living beneath that roof, she was the only such person he could find. He added that this might cost her life, and he wanted her to think carefully before answering. Camille remained motionless for a long time. Inside her mind was the face of a child 6 years old, sleeping in the servants' quarters. Then she nodded once, decisively. She said only one condition. Maeve must never know anything about this. Not one word. At exactly 11 o'clock the following night, every light in the mansion had gone dark. Juliana was in Manhattan for a dress fitting she had insisted must be scheduled in the evening. Rocco had just returned from his trip and retired to the guest house. Camille waited at the end of the hallway until the final footsteps had faded, then pushed Emilio's wheelchair toward the service elevator in the far corner. The elevator used only for carrying kitchen supplies and watched by no cameras. They descended 3 floors below ground. The doors opened onto a low-ceilinged room with thick stone walls and cold, dry air. A single yellow bulb hung overhead. In the center of the floor stood 2 parallel wooden rails that had been installed 2 days earlier under the pretense of repairing the pipes. Camille spread a thin mat beneath them, opened her leather roll, and arranged the needles in their familiar order. She performed the acupuncture first, exactly 30 minutes, without saying a word. Then she collected the needles, wiped her hands, and nodded to him. Emilio rolled his wheelchair close to the wooden rails. He placed both hands upon them, drew a long breath, then pulled his entire body upright. His arms trembled with the strain. His legs, which hadn't carried a single pound of weight in 8 months, were suddenly being forced to remember their purpose, and they responded with a pain he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. Within minutes, sweat had soaked the back of his shirt. He fell. His knees struck the mat with a heavy sound. Camille stepped forward with both hands extended. Emilio shook his head once. She stopped, returned to her former position, and lowered her hands to her sides. He braced himself against the rails and pulled himself up again. He fell. He rose. He fell once more. On the 4th attempt, his arms locked rigidly around the wooden rails, his legs trembling violently beneath his body, and he remained standing for 4 seconds. 4 seconds in a basement beneath the earth, witnessed by no one except a maid. Yet when he collapsed onto the bench with his chest heaving and his shirt drenched, he made a sound that might have been laughter or a sob. In 8 months, those were the only 4 seconds he'd stood on his own legs. Camille knelt beside the mat. She poured a little oil into her palm, rubbed her hands together until they were warm, then began massaging his calves from the heels upward, slowly and evenly. Her hands were calloused, her fingertips roughened by 4 years of scrubbing floors and washing clothes, but not one movement was off by even a fraction of an inch. She knew exactly where to stop, where to press more deeply, and where she could only touch lightly because the muscle was contracting. Those were the hands of someone who had once been properly trained and had never forgotten what she'd learned, even though for the past 4 years, people had paid her only to clean floors. She took a warm, damp cloth, wiped the sweat from his forehead, then continued her work. She didn't say one unnecessary word. She didn't praise him, comfort him, or make promises. She simply did her work. And in that silence, Emilio Ferraro sat with his back against the cold stone wall, watching the yellow bulb sway almost imperceptibly overhead, and realized something strange. He had spent 33 years in rooms where other people were always present. During those 33 years, there hadn't been a single moment when he didn't have to consider what the person opposite him was calculating. Not one meal when he hadn't read the face beside him before reading the menu. Yet down in that basement, with a woman whose name he'd truly known for less than 2 weeks, he didn't have to calculate anything. He didn't have to remain on guard. He didn't have to wear the unreadable Ferraro face. He could simply sit there, utterly exhausted, his legs feeling as though they were being torn apart, with something inside his chest he hadn't felt in many years. Peace. By the time they returned upstairs, it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Camille pushed the wheelchair all the way to his bedroom door, lowered her head in farewell, then turned away. Emilio called her back. "Tomorrow, same time." She answered yes, then disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. He remained outside his bedroom for a little while longer. 4 seconds. He repeated the number silently inside his mind. Tomorrow, it would be 5. On the 4th night after the first therapy session, Gus knocked on the study door at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning and placed a thin leather briefcase on the desk. Inside was the first report from the 4 men stationed around the outer perimeter. Emilio opened it beneath the table lamp and read in silence for almost an hour. The first page contained Dr. Elliot Brennan's movements over 7 days. 3 times that week, he left his clinic in the middle of the afternoon and drove to a small coffee shop in Pilsen, a shabby place with curtain booths along the back wall, the kind of establishment no one from Emilio's world would ever enter. All 3 times, the same person was waiting for him in one of those booths, Juliana Mancuso. There were photographs. She wore a hat, dark glasses, and a long coat Emilio had never seen her wear inside the house, with her hair arranged in an entirely different style from the one she normally favored. On the table between them lay a thick brown envelope. The next page contained financial statements. Over the course of 5 months, $2,100,000 had left Juliana's private accounts, passed through 3 shell companies established overseas, and ended in an account registered to Brennan's clinic. Everything had been constructed so carefully that nothing appeared wrong when each section was examined separately. Only when all 3 sections were connected could anyone see where they led. The final page contained an audio recording captured by a directional listening device inside a car parked outside the coffee shop. Emilio played it. There was the clinking of cups, the sound of people passing outside, then Juliana's voice, perfectly clear, cold and concise, like someone issuing instructions rather than negotiating. She told Brennan to follow the plan exactly. After the wedding, everything would be different. Emilio replayed that part 3 times. Each time he heard it, another piece inside his mind fell into place. She had been brought into his house through a marriage both families called an alliance. For 8 months, she had spoken about the wedding more often than anyone, pushed hardest to move the date forward, and brought stacks of documents to his desk while telling him to sign them and be done. She kissed his forehead every afternoon as though kissing a man who was dying. She promised him a clinic in Zurich, the finest doctors in Europe, and a day when he would stand again, speaking those promises while knowing perfectly well that whatever lay on the silver tray beside his bed each morning would never allow that day to come. She had bought the family physician outright. She had allowed Emilio to weaken month after month until he became nothing more than a name capable of signing documents. Then she would enter the house wearing a wedding ring, and everything would belong to the Mancuso family, without anyone firing a single shot. Emilio's hand tightened around the edge of the desk, until the veins stood out along his wrist. Only one name remained inside his mind, and the woman who carried it was sleeping in the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. He reviewed the video one final time before closing the briefcase, but he watched it through the eyes of a man who already carried the answer inside his mind, and such a man always saw only what he was looking for. On the screen, when the envelope was pushed across the table, Brennan's hand trembled so violently as he reached for it that he had to lower it quickly onto the wooden surface to hold it still. Twice during the meeting, he looked up and opened his mouth as though he were about to say something, only to close it tightly again and lower his gaze to the cup of coffee he hadn't touched. And there was one moment, lasting only about 2 seconds, when he turned his head toward the door, and his eyes passed directly across the camera hidden inside a decorative lamp on the wall, a camera he had no idea was there. During those 2 seconds, his face appeared clearly beneath the light. It wasn't the face of a man who had just received $2,100,000. It was the face of someone who was drowning and knew that no one was coming to pull him out. Emilio had seen that image. He simply hadn't understood it. His anger had grown so thick that it covered the glass, and everything viewed through that glass bent in the same direction. Sometimes evidence deceives the person who believes in it most. Juliana Mancuso wasn't good at many things, but there was one thing she did better than anyone else in that house. She could read Emilio Ferraro's face. She had studied it from the first day the 2 families sat down together, and she knew very well that his expression almost never changed. So when it did change, even by the smallest degree, she noticed immediately. She noticed that his gaze lingered longer than usual whenever the second-floor maid passed, carrying a tray. She noticed that he looked up when Juliana entered a room, but only out of courtesy, while when the other woman entered, he looked up because he was truly looking. At first, Juliana said nothing. She merely asked a few gentle questions over dinner, whether the new maid was efficient, whether she should bring someone from the city to replace her if necessary. Emilio answered vaguely without lifting his eyes from his plate. From that day on, Juliana began searching for mistakes. The tea tray arrived half a minute late. The fold in the tablecloth was less than half an inch out of line. The dining room window still had streaks on it. That week, Camille was ordered to repeat her work 5 times, and Juliana never raised her voice once. She merely spoke in that quiet, gentle tone that everyone in the room could hear and that made everyone lower their eyes. Then she stopped searching for mistakes. She created one. In the grand foyer, beside the foot of the staircase, stood a pendulum clock as tall as a person, something Emilio's mother had brought from Naples on the family's first voyage, and for more than 40 years, it had remained in that exact place. The night before, Juliana went down to the foyer alone and shifted its base by a few inches, just enough for it to remain upright if no one touched it, and just enough for it to fall if a current of air passed at the right moment. The following morning, she summoned almost the entire household staff to the foyer under the pretense of announcing a new work schedule. As Camille carried a tray of coffee past the foot of the stairs, Juliana stepped forward, and the hem of her long dress swept across the base of the clock. It crashed onto the marble floor. The entire foyer fell silent. Then Juliana turned around and made her move. Camille didn't cry out. She stood straight, both hands still gripping the tray so it wouldn't fall, her eyes lowered toward the stone floor. Juliana spoke loudly enough for everyone in the foyer to hear. She said the clock had belonged to her future mother-in-law, that it was worth more than a servant's entire lifetime of labor, that beginning that month, 2 months of Camille's wages would be withheld, and that she must kneel there immediately and apologize before everyone in the house. Camille didn't argue. She placed the tray carefully on the lowest stair without spilling a single drop of coffee. Then she knelt on the cold stone floor in the middle of the foyer, lowered her head, and apologized. She said it 3 times, clearly, without a tremor in her voice. At that moment, there was no clock inside her mind, no Juliana, and no 20 people standing there watching her. There was only one name on a hospital waiting list, a name that would be removed if the child's mother no longer had a monthly wage, proving she could afford to continue pursuing the surgery. Camille could rise and walk away at that moment with what little dignity she had left, but dignity couldn't buy her daughter a healthy heart. So she knelt, she lowered her head, and she apologized 3 times for something she hadn't done. The elderly cook stood at the far end of the foyer, both hands trembling violently and her eyes red with tears. But she didn't dare speak. No one dared speak. Emilio sat beside the eastern window of the foyer, about 15 paces away. He saw everything from beginning to end, including the hem of Juliana's dress brushing against the base of the clock. He remained still. Both hands rested on his lap, and the fingernails of his right hand dug so deeply into his palm that hours later he would find red marks there. He didn't move. He didn't say a single word. Because if he spoke now, if he revealed even 1% of what was moving through his chest, everything taking place in the basement each night would end that very morning, and the past 8 months would become meaningless. It isn't time. He told himself those exact 3 words. It isn't time. Juliana turned and caught him looking at her. She smiled, gently and radiantly, the smile of a woman certain that she had just won. 4 nights after that morning in the foyer, Camille woke at 3 o'clock to a faint sound from the bed beside her. Maeve was sitting upright, with both hands braced against the mattress, struggling to breathe. Her breaths came quickly and shallowly, one after another, as though she had to fight for each one. Camille turned on the light. The color had already drained from the little girl's lips. She didn't have time to think. She wrapped a blanket around her daughter, lifted her into her arms, and hurried to the door. When she reached the gravel path outside the servants' quarters, the black car was already waiting, its headlights on and its engine running. Gus Petrosino stood beside the open rear door. No one had called him. No one had notified him. Yet he was there, and he didn't ask a single question. He merely took the child while Camille climbed inside, handed Maeve back to her, closed the door, and drove away. On the road into the city, he said only one thing: hold her with her head a little higher. The children's hospital on the north side admitted Maeve at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. After daybreak, a young doctor stepped into the hallway and told Camille what she'd feared for 3 years. They couldn't wait any longer. Maeve needed surgery within 2 weeks. Then he handed her a sheet of paper with a number printed on the final line. Camille held that paper for a long time. She calculated quickly inside her mind, so quickly that even she was surprised, and the answer appeared as clearly as a door slamming shut. On her wages, even if 2 months of pay hadn't been withheld, even if she spent nothing at all on food or anything else, she still wouldn't reach that number in 10 years. She folded the paper, slipped it into her pocket, then returned to sit beside her daughter's bed. She didn't cry. She had long since passed the age when she allowed herself to cry in front of her child. The following morning, when Camille returned to the hospital after completing her morning duties, she was summoned to the administrative office. A woman handed her a collection of documents and said the entire cost of Maeve Doyle's operation had been paid in full the previous day through a medical assistance fund that didn't disclose the identity of its donors. She added that the surgery had been scheduled for the following Thursday, and that the surgeon would be the head of the hospital's cardiovascular surgery department, a physician whose patients normally had to wait until the following spring. Camille stood motionless in the middle of the room. She asked once more to make certain she'd understood. The woman nodded and pushed the papers toward her. Camille took them, thanked her, then stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall for a long while, clutching the documents tightly against her chest. She knew. No one needed to tell her. In the entire city of Chicago, only one person knew that her daughter was waiting for heart surgery, and that person had heard Camille mention it only once, during 4 brief minutes in the study at midnight, when she stated her only condition. That evening, Camille went down to the basement half an hour earlier than usual. She spread out the mat, prepared the 2 wooden rails, warmed the oil, and arranged the needles, and by the time Emilio arrived, everything was ready. She didn't say a word about the hospital. She didn't thank him. She didn't mention the documents, the department head's name, or the following Thursday. She simply did her work more carefully and for longer than before, and every night for the next 2 weeks, she went downstairs half an hour early. Emilio said nothing either. He didn't ask how the little girl was doing. He didn't mention the assistance fund or anything else. One night, while Camille was massaging his calf, he looked down at the hands working upon him and began to speak. Then he stopped. He understood that if he said it aloud, whatever existed between them in that basement would immediately become a debt, and a debt always weighed upon the shoulders of the person who received it. He had spent his entire life in a world where every favor was entered into a ledger, and every kindness eventually had to be repaid. This was the first time he'd given something without wanting anyone to repay him, so he remained silent. And she remained silent. The surgery took place on Thursday morning and lasted 5 hours. Early that afternoon, Camille was told that everything had been successful, and that from then on, her daughter's small heart would beat like the heart of any other child who was 6 years old. That night, no one in the basement mentioned what had happened, but when Camille bent down to gather the mat, Emilio saw her shoulders tremble once, very faintly, and then become still. The following night, after Maeve had fallen peacefully asleep in her hospital room, with both hands resting above the blanket and her newly mended heart beating inside her chest, Camille returned to the mansion and went down to the basement, as she did every night. She performed the acupuncture first, exactly 30 minutes as usual, then gathered the needles, wiped her hands, and stepped back to her place. Emilio rolled his wheelchair close to the 2 wooden rails, placed both hands upon them, and pulled himself upright. During the past 2 weeks, he'd remained standing longer each day. He had taken 3 steps, then 4, with both hands gripping the rails, and each time, he stopped exactly when his body told him he must. But that night, after standing steadily for about 10 seconds, he did something the therapy program hadn't yet permitted him to do. He released the rails. Camille sprang to her feet but didn't have time to speak. Emilio stood in the middle of the stone basement without holding on to anything, his arms slightly extended on either side to maintain his balance, and during the first 3 seconds, his entire body trembled, like a rope pulled taut. Then he stepped forward. 1 step, his left foot lifted, came down, and accepted his weight. 2 steps, his shoulder tilted, and he corrected himself. 3 steps, 4 steps, and by the 5th, his breathing had broken into short gasps from the pain, but he didn't stop. The 6th step, the 7th, then he stopped with both feet planted beneath him, and slowly turned, his entire upper body leaning with the movement, until he faced the place where he'd begun. 7 steps and 1 turn, with nothing supporting him except his own 2 legs. Camille raised both hands to cover her mouth. She made no sound. Tears ran down her face and through the spaces between her fingers. Yet she remained silent, because above them were 20 sleeping people, and among them was at least one person who would end everything that very night, if the truth became known. Emilio dragged himself through the final steps toward the wooden bench and collapsed onto it. His chest rose and fell heavily. His soaked shirt clung to his back. He remained that way for about a minute, with both hands braced on his knees, his head bowed as he breathed. Then he looked up at her and extended his hand. Camille approached and knelt beside the bench with the instinct of someone who, for 4 years, had known only how to kneel, and she placed her hand in the waiting palm. His hand was large, heavy, and warm, with old scars crossing his knuckles, traces of a life she would never ask about. Her hand was small, the skin across its back dry and cracked, her fingertips hardened into layers of calluses by 4 years of scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and wringing out towels, hands once trained to perform entirely different work and forced into a life she had never chosen. Emilio looked down at their joined hands for a long time. Then he spoke slowly, one word at a time, in the deep voice she'd heard throughout the past several weeks, but never in this way. He said he knew what she'd lost. He said he knew there was a name stamped inside a record somewhere in the city, and he knew that name was the reason no one returned her calls. He said he knew she'd knelt in the middle of his foyer and apologized 3 times for something she hadn't done, while he'd sat 15 paces away, unable to rise, and that he would remember it until the day he died. Then he spoke his final words. He said that on the day he stood upright before all of them, he would return everything that had been taken from her, and he made himself clear so she wouldn't misunderstand. It wasn't a favor he was granting her. It was a debt he owed. Camille didn't lower her head. Throughout the 27 years of her life, whenever a powerful man spoke to her, she'd bowed her head. She'd bowed before the director of her former clinic when they read the decision revoking her license. She'd bowed before the people behind large desks when they told her that her record wasn't acceptable. She'd bowed before the housekeeper, bowed before Rocco in the hallway, and bowed in the middle of the foyer with both hands resting on the cold stone floor. But that night, beneath the mansion, she raised her head and looked directly into Emilio's eyes. She didn't say yes. She didn't ask him for a promise, ask how he intended to repay her, or ask when. She had trusted him since the night he'd spoken her name in the study and said she was the only person he could find. She merely tightened her hand around his once, then released it, rose, and went to retrieve the bottle of oil. They returned upstairs later than usual that night. The service elevator stopped on the 2nd floor at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and when the doors opened, someone at the far end of the hallway was stepping out of the elderly cook's room, gently closing the door behind him. Elliot Brennan turned and saw them. He saw Emilio seated in the wheelchair, saw the maid standing behind him and pushing it, saw the damp towel draped over the armrest and the bottle of oil in her hand. The medical case slipped from Brennan's grasp and struck the floor. Its clasp sprang open. Several glass medicine vials rolled across the wooden floor, scattering in every direction, and in the late-night silence of that hallway, the sound of them rolling was unmistakably clear. Brennan immediately dropped to his knees and swept both hands across the floor to gather them. But his hands trembled so badly that each time he managed to touch one of the vials, it slipped through his fingers and rolled farther away, forcing him to reach for it again. It took him nearly a minute to complete a task that should have required only 10 seconds. During that entire minute, he didn't raise his head once. He didn't ask why the boss was in the hallway at that hour. He didn't ask why the maid was holding a bottle of oil. He asked nothing at all. An ordinary physician would have asked. A doctor who had spent 8 months treating a patient paralyzed in both legs would certainly have asked if he encountered that patient returning from the basement at 1 o'clock in the morning. But Brennan merely gathered his belongings, closed the case, rose, muttered something about the elderly woman's knee that even he couldn't clearly hear, then walked directly toward the stairs. Emilio remained still and watched the man's back until it disappeared completely. And this time, he looked carefully, truly carefully, for the first time in 8 months. The coat that had been tailored to Brennan's body for 11 years now hung loose from his shoulders, as though suspended on a clothes hanger. 2 new holes had been punched into his belt, and he was using the innermost one. The hair at his temples had turned completely white in the way seen only in people who had endured something very long and very heavy. And beneath the hallway light, his face wasn't the face of a man who had received a sum larger than everything he'd earned throughout his career. No one became wealthy and wasted away like that. No one sold his conscience and lost 15 pounds in 8 months. Emilio lay awake until morning. During the following 7 days, he shifted all his attention in another direction. He no longer cared where the woman in silk dresses went, whom she met, or what she bought. He told Gus to move the 4 men from the outer perimeter and assign them to a single target, Dr. Elliot Brennan. And he wanted an account of every hour in the man's day: his car, his telephone, his home, his clinic, the places where he ate, everything. 7 days later, Gus placed a thin file on the study desk. It contained only one thing worth reading. On 3 nights that week, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, Brennan left his home. He drove himself, called no driver, and notified no one. He took the highway south of the city, moved through several rows of abandoned industrial streets in Pullman, and stopped outside a warehouse with no sign. He went inside. 35 minutes later, he emerged. Each visit lasted almost exactly the same amount of time, with hardly any variation. What made Emilio read the page again and again was written on the final line. Brennan didn't carry his medical case. He took no bag, no envelope, and nothing else inside. and when he emerged, there was nothing in his hands. A man collecting money should carry something away. A man making a delivery should carry something inside. But this man arrived empty-handed, and left empty-handed 3 times a week, at 3 o'clock in the morning. And he'd been doing so for 8 months. The file included several photographs taken through a long-range lens. Emilio examined them one by one. Brennan entering beneath a broken streetlight. Brennan leaning against the side of his car after leaving the warehouse, one hand gripping the roof as though he would collapse if he released it. And in the final photograph, taken through the windshield, the man sat behind the wheel with both hands still holding it and his forehead lowered completely between them. Emilio placed the photograph on the desk and remained motionless for a very long time. A traitor didn't weep on the road home. Emilio didn't call Rocco. He didn't call any of his captains. He called a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. The number of Aldo Ricci, a man who had stood beside his father before Emilio was born, and now lived quietly in Cicero, with a bakery and a house full of grandchildren. Aldo listened, remained silent for several seconds, then asked only how many men were needed. 2 nights later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of 6 men arrived in Pullman. They wore nothing bearing the Ferraro insignia. Not one of them appeared on the official personnel records. They belonged to the old guard, men who had sworn allegiance to Emilio's father, and hadn't accepted a single dollar from anyone else during the past 14 years. Emilio sat inside an armored vehicle parked about 1,000 feet from the warehouse, hidden behind a row of abandoned railroad cars. It was the first time he'd left the mansion at night since the shooting on Lower Wacker Drive 8 months earlier. He wore a long coat that covered both his body and the wheelchair beneath him, and he didn't leave the vehicle. He wouldn't appear, allow anyone to see him, or let the Ferraro name become connected to that night. He was only a voice through an earpiece. Aldo reported from behind a row of metal containers. The thermal scanner detected 8 heat signatures moving inside the warehouse. All 8 were armed, patrolling in a closed circuit, and changing shifts precisely on schedule. These weren't careless warehouse guards. Then Aldo added something that made Emilio sit upright. Through the infrared binoculars, he could see that every one of them had the same tattoo on the left wrist. A crow. Emilio tightened his hand around the earpiece. The crow on the left wrist was the mark of the Corvino family, and Corvino was the name all of Chicago had spoken. Within 48 hours after the night Emilio was shot, the name his own men had given him along with the evidence, the name he'd repeated inside his mind for 8 months, whenever he looked down at his legs. Then why were members of the Corvino family guarding a warehouse that his private physician visited 3 times a week at 3 o'clock in the morning? The first thought struck Emilio sharply. Brennan had changed sides, but the thought collapsed almost as soon as it formed, because a man who changed sides was received inside a comfortable meeting room, not a decaying warehouse. A man who changed sides didn't arrive empty-handed and leave empty-handed. Above all, a man who changed sides didn't lower his forehead onto the steering wheel before starting the engine. Emilio ordered a complete scan of the rear of the building. Aldo remained silent for about half a minute. Then his voice returned, slower than before. He said there were 2 more heat signatures inside the rearmost chamber, behind a sealed partition. Both signatures were weak and almost motionless, one person curled in a corner and the other lying close beside her. Aldo said neither appeared to be armed, and their breathing patterns weren't those of healthy people. Inside the vehicle, Emilio closed his eyes. During the next 30 seconds, the entire structure he'd built inside his mind over the past several weeks began to fracture. The envelope on the coffee shop table, the trembling hand forced down against the wood, the 2 times Brennan opened his mouth, then closed it again. The gaze that passed over the hidden camera, a look Emilio had seen but refused to understand. He opened his eyes and spoke into the earpiece, his voice calm but every word distinct. Go in. Subdue all 8 men. No one dies. He repeated that last instruction twice, because he needed every one of them capable of speaking. Then he ordered them to protect the 2 people in the rear chamber at any cost. 4 minutes. That was all it took. When Aldo reported that it was over, Emilio remained inside the vehicle. The 2 captives were carried through the rear entrance wrapped in blankets. One was a woman 52 years old. The other was a young woman 19 years old. Both were so exhausted that they needed help with every step, and their skin carried the pallor of people who hadn't seen daylight in many weeks. The older woman kept a tight grip on her daughter's hand and refused to let anyone approach until Aldo Ricci knelt in front of her, placed both hands where she could clearly see them, and said, "Elliot sent us." She began to weep. She wept like someone who had held everything inside for 8 months. 2 cars left Pullman before dawn and traveled north toward a lakeside house in Lake Geneva, where doctors, warm blankets, and a fire were already waiting. On the journey back to the mansion, Emilio didn't say a word. He stared through the window, while the entire system of conclusions he'd believed with certainty for weeks collapsed piece by piece inside his mind, exposing an emptiness behind it that he didn't yet dare name. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Elliot Brennan knocked on the study door, punctual as he'd been for 11 years. He placed his case on the side table, opened it, removed a syringe and a medicine vial, and his hands began performing the motions his entire body knew so well that his mind no longer needed to participate. Emilio said nothing. He merely pushed his telephone across the desk, with the screen turned toward the doctor, and a video was playing. In the video, there was a window overlooking the lake in the morning, a woman wrapped in a blanket and sitting in an armchair, and beside her, a young woman sleeping with her head resting on her mother's shoulder. The older woman looked directly into the camera. Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence as she said, "Elliot, our daughter and I are safe now." The syringe fell from Brennan's hand and shattered on the wooden floor. He didn't pick it up. He stood there for about 2 seconds, his entire body pitching forward. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed onto them in the middle of the study. He covered his face with both hands and made a sound unlike anything Emilio had ever heard from a grown man. Emilio didn't help him rise. He poured a glass of wine, placed it on the floor beside the doctor's trembling hand, then rolled his wheelchair back and waited. And Brennan told him. He told him everything in one unbroken rush, like a man who had rehearsed this confession inside his mind for 8 months and had only been waiting for someone to give him permission to speak. On the night Emilio was shot on Lower Wacker Drive, while the entire city was in turmoil over the news that the Ferraro boss had taken a bullet, 2 women were quietly removed from a house in a peaceful neighborhood on the north side, without anyone noticing. The man who arranged it wasn't a stranger. Rocco Barone had been there in person, leaving no trace for the police to follow. The following morning, while Brennan was still calling everywhere in search of his wife and daughter, the door of his clinic opened and Rocco walked inside, placed a photograph and a bottle of white pills on the desk, then said exactly one thing. "This is your wife's life. 2 pills every day until I tell you to stop." Brennan said he'd immediately recognized what was inside that bottle. He knew exactly what it would do to a body after 3 months, after 6 months, after a year. He said that every morning he walked through the mansion gates. He felt as though he were entering the place where he would die, and every time he watched Emilio tilt his head back and swallow, he wanted to scream but couldn't. He said that whenever he hesitated, another photograph was sent to him, and 3 times a week, they forced him to drive to Pullman at 3 o'clock in the morning and look at his wife and daughter through a narrow opening in the partition for exactly 35 minutes. He wasn't permitted to speak or approach them. He could only look, then drive home. That was how they kept him obedient. Emilio asked about the woman in the Pilsen coffee shop. Brennan raised his head, his eyes bloodshot, and said Juliana Mancuso knew everything. She had known from the beginning, and no one had forced her to do anything. The money she transferred to him wasn't payment for buying him, because he'd already been purchased with something else. It was her contribution to a division of power that had been planned in advance. She was only the mask placed in front of it. Then Brennan spoke the name. He said the person who designed the entire scheme, the man behind every move, was Rocco Barone. And Rocco had reached an agreement with the Corvino family 2 years earlier. The ambush on Lower Wacker Drive hadn't been an unprovoked attack by the Corvino family. It was the opening move. And the person who made it was the foster brother who had lived in that house since he was 12 years old. Emilio asked his final question. Why hadn't they ended everything that same night? Brennan answered that Rocco needed him alive. Alive, seated in the wheelchair, growing weaker, and still alert enough to hold a pen and sign the transfer documents after the wedding. The bylaws Emilio's father had written 40 years earlier. The provision the old man included to protect his son from those standing closest to him were what had unintentionally kept Emilio breathing for the past 8 months. Brennan fell silent for a while, then added something he said he'd only discovered recently. The pain relief clinic in Northbrook, where a patient died 3 years earlier, and someone needed a name to place in the official report, was registered under another person's name, but its money flowed to the Corvino family. The same hand had erased the career of the woman massaging Emilio's legs in the basement every night, and had erased Emilio's legs themselves. Emilio remained motionless for 20 minutes after Brennan finished speaking. He wasn't angry. Anger had passed long ago, and what remained behind it was far quieter. His paralyzed legs had turned out to be the smaller wound. Emilio didn't make Brennan pay. He told the doctor only one thing. Beginning the following morning, Brennan would still pass through those gates at 7 o'clock as he'd done for 11 years, still open his case, still write in his notebook, still smile at Rocco in the hallway, and still give Emilio exactly 1 injection every morning. The only difference was that from now on, the syringe would contain nothing but saline. He said that if Rocco became suspicious for even 1 second, both the Brennan family and the Ferraro family would be buried on the same day. Brennan nodded. There was no hesitation left in his eyes, only the reckless determination of a man who had just been given the chance to redeem something he'd believed was lost forever. During the next 2 weeks, Emilio Ferraro lived 2 lives at once. By day, he was the man they had all seen throughout the past 8 months. He sat in his wheelchair from morning until night, without leaving it once. He rolled up his sleeve for Brennan's injection, and stared through the window with the weariness of someone who had lost all hope. Rocco brought every kind of document to his desk. The seating plan for the Grand Hall, the guest list, the menu, the contract with the band, and finally, always, the thickest collection of papers, the documents transferring 60% of Emilio's personal assets to the Mancuso family immediately after the wedding. Emilio skimmed them, asked 1 or 2 questions for appearance's sake, then nodded and told Rocco to proceed as he thought best. Every afternoon, Juliana came to him, perched on the arm of his chair, and spoke about the dress, the flowers, and the apartment in Zurich, where she claimed she'd already placed a deposit so they could travel there for treatment immediately after their honeymoon. Emilio took her hand, kissed the back of it, and told her she looked radiant that day. Not once did his eyes reveal the faintest trace of suspicion. 33 years spent in a world where one facial muscle moving at the wrong moment could cost a man his life had finally found its purpose. By night, the man in the wheelchair disappeared. Beneath the yellow bulb in the basement, Emilio ran around the old wine racks until his lungs burned and sweat dripped onto the stone floor. He practiced rising and sitting hundreds of times. He had Camille throw a ball in different directions to retrain the reflexes his body had forgotten during 8 months of stillness. He made her read the Grand Hall floor plan aloud, then closed his eyes and repeated every entrance, every service door, every window, and every distance measured in steps from the ceremonial platform to each exit. Camille didn't ask why he needed to know those things. She simply followed his instructions, and every night, she saw him stand a little more steadily. On another morning in Cicero, inside the back room of a bakery still fragrant with the scent of baked dough, 3 elderly men gathered around a dining table covered with a checkered cloth. Aldo Ricci, Sam Vitali, and Nico Greco. All 3 had served Emilio's father before serving him, and during the past 14 years, not one of them had accepted a single dollar from Rocco Barone. Emilio placed everything he possessed on the table and told the story from the beginning without concealing one detail. When he finished, the room became so quiet that the faint crackling of the oven could be heard through the wall. Then, one by one, the 3 men rose, walked around the table, bent down, and kissed the ring on Emilio's hand without saying a word. Every piece of evidence was copied and sent to 3 places Rocco could never reach. Throughout those 2 weeks, Rocco Barone noticed only one thing. While drinking coffee with Juliana on the porch one morning, he said the boss had been smiling more often lately. He said that just the day before, Emilio had recalled an old story from the days when the 2 of them stayed in the warehouse on Taylor Street and had laughed aloud. Juliana shrugged, stirred her coffee, and said he'd accepted his fate. Every man eventually had to accept it. Rocco nodded, satisfied, and gave the matter no further thought. Emilio's plan, however, had been complete since the morning he sat motionless in the study for 20 minutes. He wouldn't have Rocco ambushed on the road. He wouldn't send anyone to knock on the man's door at midnight. A death in the darkness always gave birth to 10 rumors, and among those 10, at least one would claim that the Ferraro boss had panicked and purged his own brother. Emilio wanted the opposite. He wanted all of them to see it with their own eyes, at the same moment, inside the same room. He would allow everything to unfold exactly as Rocco had arranged it, on the chosen day, at the appointed hour, and according to the seating plan he'd drawn. Then Emilio would expose everything in the middle of his own wedding, before the 280 most powerful people on the East Coast and throughout the Midwest, in a place where no rumor could distort the truth and no lawyer could untangle it. The wedding day arrived on an autumn afternoon, when the maple leaves lining the drive had turned the color of bronze, and the Chicago sky was so clear that the paths of airplanes could be seen above the lake. 280 people filled every seat in the grand hall of the Ferraro mansion. The old families of the East Coast occupied the front rows. Beside them sat the prominent names of the Midwest, and behind them were several men in gray suits from the financial world. Along one side aisle sat 2 politicians who had entered through a side door with their assistants. Rocco Barone stood beside the ceremonial platform in a tailored black suit, both hands clasped before him with the modest bearing of a brother who had taken responsibility for arranging everything on behalf of the family. He had planned every detail. Early that morning, he had brought 18 members of the Corvino family onto the estate, dressed in Ferraro uniforms, wearing Ferraro insignia, and stationed at the main gates, the service entrance, the security control room, and the 2 guard towers overlooking the garden. What he didn't know was that all 18 men had been subdued and taken to the security room 20 minutes earlier. They wore earpieces, and throughout those 20 minutes, Aldo Ricci's men had been answering in their place over the same frequency. Downstairs in the kitchen, Camille stood beside the row of ovens, arranging pastries on silver trays. She wasn't permitted inside the grand hall. In the rose garden, 2 hallways away from the ceremony, Maeve ran among the bushes with a teddy bear in her hand, while the doctor's wife watched from a stone bench, occasionally calling for the little girl not to run so quickly. At exactly 3 o'clock, the string quartet raised their bows. Giuliana Mancuso entered on her father's arm, the train of her lace gown trailing behind her, her smile so radiant that no one in the hall imagined it was the smile of a woman about to win, rather than one about to marry. Emilio sat in his wheelchair beside the ceremonial platform, his head slightly bowed and both hands resting on his lap, wearing the exact posture they had all grown accustomed to seeing during the past 8 months. The priest began in Latin, then changed to English. Candles burned. Light from the crystal chandeliers scattered across gold rings and silk lapels. Rocco cast a quick glance toward the 3 large doors where his men were stationed, and he saw Ferraro uniforms standing in the proper places with the proper posture. Everything was ready. The priest raised his voice and asked, "Emilio Ferraro, do you take Giuliana Mancuso as your wife, to love and protect her, in sickness and in health, until death parts you?" The entire hall waited in silence for his answer. Emilio placed both hands upon the rims of his wheelchair. Then he stood. 3 seconds passed without a sound inside the room. 280 people, who had witnessed wars, betrayals, ascensions, and collapses, now sat with their mouths open, staring toward the platform with the expressions of children seeing snow for the first time. In the 4th row, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the marble floor, and the sound rang through the grand hall like a bell. Emilio stood upright, tall and broad-shouldered, then adjusted the button of his suit jacket with a hand that didn't tremble. Then he walked. He passed Giuliana, who stood rooted in place, her face as white as the lace of her gown. He passed Rocco, his friend of 14 years, who stood rigid with his jaw clenched and the muscles in his forearms beginning to tighten. Emilio climbed the 3 steps of the ceremonial platform, stopped beside the motionless priest holding an open book, and lifted the microphone from its stand with the composure of a man preparing to address a boardroom. He apologized to the guests for interrupting the ceremony, and said there were several truths everyone needed to know before he placed his signature on anything that day. Then he raised one hand. The large projection screen behind the platform, originally prepared to display wedding photographs, came to life. The certified laboratory report, the recorded testimony of Dr. Elliot Brennan, Rocco Barone's voice in an audio recording, echoing from the speakers of that very hall, Giuliana Mancuso's financial transactions, the structure of the joint operation Rocco had established with the Corvino family, and finally, a photograph taken through a long-range lens, sharp enough to reveal every fold in their clothing, showing Rocco shaking hands with the head of the Corvino family inside a private hotel suite on Michigan Avenue 74 days earlier. Each image fell upon the room like a blade driven into wood. The people in the front rows turned to look at one another. Whispers rose, then died. Someone in the back sprang to his feet. Giuliana collapsed into the folds of white lace, both hands braced against the marble floor. Rocco stepped backward once, then again, his eyes sweeping across the large doors, searching for the Ferraro uniforms he'd positioned there that morning, searching for the single nod that would have changed everything. There was no one left. Rocco backed toward the edge of the platform, and at that moment, the service door in the corner of the grand hall burst open. Camille rushed up from the kitchen stairs because she'd heard the shattering glass and the raised voices, and before she could understand what was happening, Rocco seized her arm and dragged her behind him. Everyone in the grand hall sprang to their feet, then dropped back into their seats. Aldo Ricci's men had filled every exit, their hands already inside their jackets, but not one of them dared move. Emilio raised a hand and ordered them to stop. Then he did something none of the 280 people present that day could have imagined. He reached inside his suit jacket, drew out what he was carrying, bent down, placed it on the marble floor, and pushed it sliding beyond his own reach. Then he raised both hands to shoulder height and descended the 3 steps of the ceremonial platform, slowly, unarmed and unprotected. He called Rocco by name. Not the name all of Chicago used, but the name he'd carried when he was 12 years old. The name his mother had called him at his father's funeral. The name only 2 people in the world still remembered. Emilio said this was between 2 brothers, and told him not to involve someone who had nothing to do with it. He said that if Rocco needed someone, he should take Emilio. He was standing there. He wouldn't run. For one brief moment, Rocco's face changed, as though the boy of 12 were looking out from behind the man of 41. Then the moment disappeared. He released Camille and turned toward Emilio. Camille didn't step back. She was already there, and she seized Rocco's arm with both hands and forced it downward with the full weight of her body. At the exact moment a gunshot exploded through the grand hall, she collapsed onto the stone floor. The fabric over her shoulder darkened. 90 seconds later, it was over. Emilio knelt beside her, pulled the handkerchief from his breast pocket, and pressed it firmly against her shoulder while supporting her head with his other hand. Dr. Brennan rushed forward from the rear rows. Camille opened her eyes, looked up at the face bending over her, and whispered exactly 4 words. "You can stand now." Then she lost consciousness in his arms. The surgery lasted 7 hours. She survived. The entire collection of evidence Emilio had assembled over many weeks was delivered directly to the federal prosecutor's office, and Rocco Barone and Giuliana Mancuso were indicted on a list of charges so long that no lawyer dared accept their cases. The Corvino family collapsed from within over the following months, as those who had once followed them turned away one after another. Dr. Elliot Brennan remained the family's private physician, not because he was afraid, but because he was grateful. The old records from the Northbrook Clinic were reopened. The name stamped 3 years earlier was cleared, and Camille Doyle's professional license was fully restored. 1 year later, spring returned to Chicago. Maeve was 7 years old, her heart healthy, running through the garden on legs that never wanted to remain still. In the quiet courtyard where no shadows could reach them anymore, the second wedding took place outdoors with exactly 40 guests. Every one of them, someone who had remained loyal. Emilio stood upright beside his bride, with no wheelchair beneath him. The leather roll containing the needles rested inside a small glass cabinet in the library, without a plaque or a single written explanation beside it. Camille opened a free therapy clinic for dock workers on the South Side, men and women whose calloused hands looked exactly like hers had during those years. This story leaves us with one very simple truth. The person who hurts us most is rarely the enemy standing before us. More often, it is the person to whom we gave our complete trust. And the person who pulls us from the abyss isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, it is the person we once looked down upon, the person we never truly noticed. A person's worth has never been determined by the uniform they wear or the work they do. It lies in how they treat others when no one is watching. Kindness is never a wasted investment, because some seeds are planted quietly and don't grow into trees that shade our own lives until many years later. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like and share this video with the people you love. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that more meaningful stories can reach you every day. How do you feel about Camille and Emilio's story? Which part moved you most deeply? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with abundant health, a peaceful spirit, and joy in every passing day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next story.